Okay. Okay, so please take source sheets, come in. It's when we scheduled these classes, we never thought we would have to accommodate the Cubs postseason. This is not something you think about schedule these or who knows, but really, nonetheless, well, we'll see. That's too soon, but still gratifying that you all came here and really gratifying every week to have you back in Anshe Shalom. It's been now 3 years that you've come to teach here, and since arriving in Chicago, and since we both arrived in Chicago, and we're really happy to have you back sharing your Torah scholarship with the community. The only thing I'll say, just as a remark, because the topics that we're going to be discussing together and learning about this week and then in Rabbi Reiss's follow-up shiur are topics of existential import to some people, and I just want to kind of just put that out there, that if either if it concerns how you may make a family, or it may even be how you came into the world perhaps, and some of these topics. So it's just, if something is of acute personal importance to you, we can follow up personally. Rabbi Reiss is available to follow up personally, and it's always hard to hear, in the abstract, to be hearing about something which is of existential importance maybe to some individuals. So but we're aware of that, and please follow up. Don't stew in your own juices. Just follow up with either one of us afterwards. And Rabbi Reiss, please, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Wolkenfeld. It's really nice to be back here. And I gather that everyone who's present tonight are probably not ardent baseball fans. Or, if you are big baseball fans, maybe you've just given up hope by now. 3-game series deficit. Or maybe you've been watching all of the previous games and you figure that your watching the game has had a bad effect on the Cubs' performance, so they'll do better if you don't watch and just kind of catch up later. Or just the topic that I'm speaking about is so incredibly fascinating that it outweighs everything else. So I know that this is it's a relatively sensitive subject that we've chosen for this year. You can blame Rabbi Wolkenfeld for that. I think he asked me to speak about these matters regarding the paternity and maternity, the special assisted reproductive technologies, and what is permissible, what's not permissible, what are the ramifications. So I wanted to choose a very delicate and sensitive title, so that's why I'm calling this Whose Wife Is It Anyway? So I apologize for the provocative nature of the title, but it just came to mind since I wanted something which was catchy. And we'll see that it's a question that is applicable to at least a certain portion of the discussion. Now we have 2 sessions, so tonight we'll discuss some of the basic areas in which the assisted reproductive technology subject comes to mind. And next time around, we'll also speak about some of the sensitive questions that arise in connection with sexual orientation, transgender issues, and things of that variety as well, because I want to cover as much of the gamut of the modern scene of reproductive technology and sexual orientation and all of those family-related issues as we enter into an era where the family in general is defined more broadly in the society and Supreme Court decisions and our general culture, and it's important to analyze all of those changes from the standpoint of halakha, from Jewish law, from the standpoint of Jewish philosophy. So as you can see, I have no qualms about getting myself into trouble, because my general perspective is that God put us on this earth at this time and this place for a reason, and we're meant to grapple with the realities of the world. That's our job. Otherwise, Hashem would have just put us in a different era. He would have put us in a different location. He would have insulated us from all of these different issues. The fact that we're not insulated means that we're supposed to grapple with them and we're supposed to tackle them. So let's try to do that as responsibly as possible. So I'll start off just as an introductory statement with the notion that from the standpoint of Jewish law and Jewish philosophy, enabling individuals to be able to build a family is essentially viewed as a fundamental right. You don't have to find some interpretive clause in the Constitution to come to that conclusion. That is already stated in our Constitution, as it were, in the Torah. The Torah talks about how there's a mitzvah pruavu of procreation, and there are many stories in the book of Bereshis that we're reading right now each week in Shul about how when there were difficulties in having children between Abraham and Sarah, between Yitzchak and Rivka, with respect to Yaakov and Rachel, there were earnest discussions and conversations about steps, even extraordinary steps that could be taken in order to ensure that a family would be built. Much of the theme of the entire book of Bereshis is how much we have to be sensitive to the desire of a man, of a woman, a father, mother, to be able to bring children into the world. So therefore, we know that hashkafically speaking, this is something which is a major value from the standpoint of the actual mitzvah that is fulfilled. So a man has the mitzvah pruavu, of populating the world through its discussion. How does one fulfill pruavu? Is it through, do you have to have a certain number of children? How many children? So the way in which we rule in halacha is that pruavu requires a son and a daughter, a zachar and a nekeva to be born, and for them to be able to then be fruitful and multiply for future generations as well. And there's a whole question, how can the Torah impose an obligation which is outside of a person's control? Some people might have more procreative ability or opportunities than other individuals. Maybe someone will only give birth to sons or only give birth to daughters. So how can you circumscribe it in this fashion that it must be at least one son, one daughter? My wife and I had to go through 5 boys until finally we were able to have a girl, thank God. But how do you define a mitzvah in this fashion? There's a whole discussion about this in the Minchas Chinuch, and his commentary to the Sefer Chinuch, which goes through also the 613 mitzvahs, of course, and this is the very first mitzvah, and quotes really from a Tosfos that seems to indicate that the nature of the mitzvah is not the having of the children, but making an effort to have the children. And then, at the point in time in which a man has a son and a daughter, then he becomes exempt from having to continue his efforts to perform the mitzvah. But the main mitzvah is to get married, to engage in procreative relations, and to try to do whatever one can in order to bring the son and daughter into the world. If for whatever reason a person or a couple is not able to have children, so they're not blamed for it per se. There's no obligation to engage in extraordinary efforts of assisted reproductive technologies to bring children into the world. But to the extent that a couple wants to do that, that's very understandable and something which is viewed as a value. Does a woman have a mitzvah herself of procreation? So there's no mitzvah, the Gemara concludes, of pruavu, but very likely there's a mitzvah called shevis. There's a pasuk that says, Lo so v'ra l'shevis yitzara, that God did not create the world to be a wasteland, but rather it should be l'shevis yitzara, it should be occupied, and there's that, in order to fulfill that mitzvah, it's sufficient to bring one child into the world, and according to many opinions, women have the obligation of shevis to try to bring at least one child into the world. And even if there would be no obligation, a woman has the right to insist with respect to her husband, in the context of a married couple, that the husband should help her bring the children into the world, even if the husband has already fulfilled the mitzvah of pruavu, because she wants a child, what's called chutra liyada, a stick in her hands, that she'll have somebody to assist her, umara l'kfura, and since it was generally anticipated that the wives would outlive the husbands, at least in many cases, so she should have a child to help to bury her, to just be there for her towards the end of her life. This is considered to be a legitimate request. It's considered to be grounds for divorce if a man refuses to try to have children with his wife, and therefore this is something which is viewed as important and vital to both men and to women. And finally, there's also the consideration of shalom bayis, of having a happy marital home. How can one imagine a happy marital home without children to scream at? So, for purposes of shalom bayis as well, the Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Tezayin says that Amar Torah b'shvil shalom bayis yimach Shem Hashem alamayim, that for purposes of shalom bayis, the name of God, which was written on a sheet of paper, on a scroll, would be erased for purposes of the sota ritual, when a man would suspect his wife of infidelity and she would drink from the sota waters. Even though it might not seem like it at first glance, the whole purpose of this ritual, we're told by the Gemara, was for purposes of bringing about shalom bayis. So the husband would calm down a little bit, he would appreciate his wife, and after it would be revealed that she was not unfaithful after all, then one of the first consequences would be that immediately following the ritual she would become pregnant and she would give birth to beautiful children. And in order to bring that about, if it means that we have to erase the name of Hashem, even that is considered to be worthwhile for this cause. Finally, Rav Avraham Steinberg, who is the editor and publisher of the Encyclopedia of Halacha and Medicine, writes in his discussion of these reproductive issues that we have a general principle when it comes to anything of a medical or therapeutic nature, that whatever is not explicitly prohibited by the Torah, we already know is permitted by the Torah. That goes without saying. If it's not prohibited, then it's permitted. But he says in the nature, in the context of medicine or therapy, whatever is not prohibited is mandatory. That we have an obligation to facilitate reproductive techniques and technologies that would assist couples who are experiencing infertility to help them bring children into the world. So one, I suppose, old-fashioned and traditional way of being able to bring children into the world when a couple is having fertility problems is, of course, to adopt a child. And it's important to note, this is the source number one in the materials, that the Torah in a number of places calls a child who was adopted after the names of that adoptive child's adoptive parents, as in the case of the child who was born to Rus, that we're told that the Yulad Bein LeNaomi, when Rus gave birth, they said, a child has been born to Naomi, who was Rus's mother-in-law. So the Gemara asks, Naomi Yalda, V'halo Rusi Yalda, Ela Rusi Yalda, V'Naomi Gidla, Lefikach Nikra Al Shema. Rather, Rus gave birth, but Naomi is the one who raised the child, therefore the child is called after the name of Naomi, and based on this example and other proofs as well, the Gemara quotes Amar Bishwil ben Achmeni, Amar Yona, Komalami ben Chaveiro Torah, Male Elav Akasu Kili Yaldu. You can bring somebody up by nourishing and nurturing them within the context of a loving and stable home. And the same goes to providing the child with the spiritual tools that the child needs in terms of teaching them Torah. We see that the Torah says these are the generations of Aaron and Moshe, And then immediately after that is stated, we're given the names of the children of Aaron, because Moshe taught them Torah, so it's considered on some level like Moshe was the father. So based on this Gemara, you look at source number 2, in the Chachma Shlomo, by Rav Shlomo Kluger. He was a prolific Torah personality. He lived primarily in the 19th century. Rav Shlomo Kluger said that it's very possible that if somebody raises like an orphan child who lost their parents, and somebody takes responsibility for raising a child, who adopt a child from another country, who was abandoned, or whose parents are not available for whatever reason, then it's very possible that this would constitute a fulfillment of the mitzvah of procreation, a fulfillment of the mitzvah of pru or vu. Says that it depends on two different opinions. Whenever the Gemara says that if you do A, it's ki'ilu, it's as if you've done B. So according to one opinion, it's as if, but it's not quite the same as doing B. According to the other opinion, no, it's considered exactly the same as doing B. So according to that second opinion, since the Gemara says it's as if you've given birth to that child, if you adopt the child and raise the child, according to that opinion, one could actually fulfill the mitzvah of procreation. It's important to bear that in mind. There aren't as many adoptions that take place nowadays, but adoption is still very much a viable option, and it's considered to be a tremendous mitzvah. Now, if a couple is having trouble having a child naturally, and they very much want to have a natural child, like for example, I had a great aunt, my great aunt Sylvia was not able to have children naturally. Who knows, if she had lived nowadays, maybe they would have found some sort of reproductive technology that could have helped her and her husband, but they were a very loving couple, and they got married young. She got married young. She was 16, maybe he was 26, something like that. But they lived together in happy matrimony for many decades, until his death in his 70s. And they were never blessed with children. And the question was always discussed in hushed whispers within our family, why didn't they adopt any children? Because she felt very bad that she wasn't able to have children. And the answer was that my great aunt didn't want to. She wanted to only have natural children. There's a certain type of affection that she felt that she would be able to experience if it was a natural child, and she just didn't feel that she would necessarily have that same natural affection if it was an adopted child. And that's the reason, I was told, that was the reason why they never decided to adopt any children. I mean, effectively, they sort of adopted because they were extremely close with all their nephews and nieces. And in fact, and then in the next generation with all the great nephews and great nieces, so there really was that type of nurturing relationship anyway. But adoption clearly is not for everybody. So Rav Moshe Feinstein discusses whether if you have a couple that's having difficulty conceiving because of niddah laws, whether the niddah laws could be relaxed at all. According to the laws of niddah, when a woman has her menstrual cycle, she's supposed to wait a 5-day period in which the cycle continues, and even if it stops during that 5-day period, she has to still count the full 5 days. And then she does a hefsek tara, she has a separation in which she sees that the bleeding has stopped, and then she counts 7 clean days, after which she goes to the mikveh and is able to be together with her husband again. So the question is, what if the only time that the ovulation would be taking place, according to the doctors, would be a time prior to the end of that 12-day cycle that normally a woman, which is the minimal amount that a woman normally has to wait before going to the mikveh, can the time period be reduced? So Rav Moshe Feinstein writes, and many others concur with this as well, that since the 5th day of the 5 days is really a stringency, in fact, when a woman gets married, when she's a kala, she counts the 4 days followed by the 7 clean days. So the 5th day is a stringency based on a remote fear of a couple who's together close to the end of the day and so forth. So since it's that the day is really added on as an extra stringency, one can be lenient in such a case if the doctors determine that the best time for ovulation for a woman who's having difficulty conceiving is after 11 days as opposed to after 12 days, to allow the 7 clean day period to begin 1 day earlier. So that was Moshe's innovation. But in terms of any other reduction of the days, since the laws of Nida are very, very strict and they're very severe, they're based on Torah law, so the consensus of the poskim, but Moshe Feinstein writes this in a different responsum, in a different shuva as well, is that that's about as far as you can go. You can cut down the 5 days to 4 days, but you can't really cut down any further. So if it's determined that a woman would only be able to conceive during the 7 clean days, for example, then before the expiration of the 11 days, then one would still be in difficult straits. And there are lots of other situations where the doctors determine that for whatever reason the woman is just not able to conceive during normal relations with her husband under any circumstances. So then the question becomes, is there any other type of resolution for a couple in that situation? Sometimes it's a question of finding an opportunity during the days in which the woman is a nida to be able to impregnate her in permissible fashion. And sometimes it's a question of just being able to inject the zera, the seed of the husband, in a fashion in which it's under a more controlled environment with medical supervision, so that it can be ensured that the fertilization process will be more successful. That's what leads us to what's commonly known as artificial insemination. Artificial insemination is when the seed of the husband is extracted in sort of a laboratory type of setting, and then it's injected directly into the womb of his wife, in a way in which the chances of procreation, the chances of fertilization of the woman's egg will become much greater, and will be more likely to be successful and to yield a child. And this is something which raises the question, is this process permissible? And would the child be considered to be the child of the man, even if it's not a direct result of a normal act of intercourse? And believe it or not, there are actual discussions regarding this issue that date back to Talmudic times, even though they didn't have artificial insemination per se in Talmudic times. But the Gemara, source number 4, discusses a question of if you had a woman who became artificially inseminated in a bathtub. I don't know too many cases where I've heard of this happening, but you have a woman who takes a bath, and a man had left some zera, had left some seed in the bath, forgot to take it with him, and the zera, the seed, goes inside of the woman's womb, and it fertilizes an egg inside of her body, and a child is born. So is she considered to have had relations with the man? And the question, the way it's posed in the Gemara, seems to be, would this woman be allowed to marry a Kohen Gadol? An interesting question, because a Kohen, I'm a regular Kohen. I don't know. Right now we don't have a Kohen Gadol. I mean, I'm kind of competing with my sons for the title, but a regular Kohen is allowed to marry a woman who had a relationship, as long as it was with a Jewish man with whom she'd be permitted to be married, even if it was out of wedlock. That doesn't prohibit her to marry a husband down the road. Or if she was an almana, if she was a widow, she's allowed to marry a regular Kohen. The fact that a woman once had relations doesn't automatically prohibit every single woman from marrying a Kohen. But a Kohen Gadol, we're told, has to marry a woman who never had relations with anybody. So the question is, this woman who became impregnated without having an intimate relationship, would she be allowed to marry a Kohen Gadol? And the Gemara has an interesting response. The Gemara says that the Gemara's question, the way it began, was, if I have a woman who just became pregnant without an intimate relationship, can she marry a Kohen Gadol? Do we say that it's possible to have an intimate relationship without the woman losing her virginity. So the Gemara discounts that suggestion and says, Chayshinan, no, you know what? There is a possibility that maybe you could have such a woman who wouldn't have had a relationship altogether with anybody. Shema Bambati Ibra, maybe she became pregnant through a bathtub without having relations with anybody. It's interesting because normally when the Gemara says Chayshinan, it means we're worried about something for purposes of being strict. Here the Gemara is saying Chayshinan, we're worried about something for the purposes of being lenient. That we have to worry that maybe there wasn't a relationship and she really can still marry a Kohen Gadol. And this teaches us a very important lesson in terms of the rabbinate, which is that you have to be more worried that you're missing out on giving somebody a leniency than worry for purposes of giving out a stringency. Especially when it comes to these matters, when a person's life and well-being is at stake, and it's a question of can they marry somebody or not, so then you have to worry about thinking about every possible leniency. So here as well, the Gemara says, Chayshinan, no, maybe this girl could still marry a Kohen Gadol because it could be she got pregnant in the bath. So there's a whole question among later authorities about whether this is just a theoretical discussion or whether this is something that can really happen. But regardless of the probability of this sort of thing happening in a bathtub, this discussion in the Gemara has halachic import for our modern times with respect to what we know really can happen in terms of artificial insemination, which is overseen through a responsible medical process. Then the question becomes, well, what happens to the child who would be born in this particular fashion? Would that child be considered, obviously the child would be the child of the mother who gives birth to it, but would the child be considered to be the child of the father who had produced the zera? So here there are strange midrashim that are brought, and there's a Midrash which is brought in a sefer called the Hagos HaSmak, about Ben Sira. Ben Sira was a personality. He's quoted a lot in the Gemara. There's a whole sefer, Ben Sira. I don't know if it's part of what would be called the Apocrypha or something like that. And Ben Sira was kind of like the Will Rogers of the Jewish tradition. He had all kinds of aphorisms and witty sayings and folk sayings and the like. And they quote Ben Sira even in the Gemara, and they try to sometimes provide scriptural proofs and scriptural sources for some of the wise and witty folk sayings that he said to show that there is Torah support for some of his wisdom. So there's this very interesting midrashic source that indicates that Ben Sira was the son of none other than Yirmiyahu. It goes back a long time. He was the son of none other than Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Yirmiyahu is the author of Megillas Eicha that we read on Tisha B'Av, the famous Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, and the proof of this is that the gematria of Sira, which is 271, is exactly the same as the gematria of Yirmiyahu, but the way he was born was perhaps a little bit scandalous, so they didn't want to call him Ben Yirmiyah, so they called him Ben Sira instead, because he was actually the son of Yirmiyahu, Yirmiyahu's son, which itself wouldn't be so scandalous, but the mother was Yirmiyahu's daughter, because what happened was that Yirmiyahu also apparently took a bath. And suffice to say that according to this Midrash, Yirmiyah's daughter gave birth to Ben Sira through her father's zera that entered into her body through the bath. And we don't find any hint or suggestion in rabbinic literature that there was any kind of illegitimacy or taint of illegitimacy with respect to Ben Sira, which would seem to indicate that a relationship of artificial insemination does not create any kind of taint of illegitimacy regardless of who the donor is. But it also indicates, since he was called Ben Sira as a reference to being Ben Yirmiyahu, that he actually did have a filial relationship with Yirmiyahu based on the fact that Yirmiyahu had contributed the zera. Yirmiyahu had contributed the seed. Okay, So that is one source. With respect to this is actually, this source is found in Likutei Mahario as well regarding Ben Sira. The Hagos Samak brings the following case. The Hagos Samak says, well, if a woman is married to a man, he says it's okay that she can go to sleep on a sheet in which her husband has slept, even when she's a nida, because we're not worried, even if the zera of her husband goes into her during that time, it's not considered to be as if they had relations while she was a nida, and the child won't be considered to be the child of a nida. But she shouldn't sleep on sheets where another man slept, because then she may give birth, and this child will really be the child of the other man. And maybe when the child grows up, let's say it's a daughter, she might marry the son of that other man and not realize that she's really marrying her half-brother. And you're not allowed, according to Torah law, to marry your half-brother or half-sister, obviously. So therefore, she should stay away from sleeping on those sheets. So in the very first chapter in the Shulchan Aruch, Ibn Ezer, the Beit Shmuel, a commentator of Shmuel Feivish, who lived towards the end of the 17th century, he brings a proof from this that if a man's zera, man's seed, goes into a woman's body, even through a bathhouse type of incident, that the child would be considered the child of the father. So these are all sources that are marshaled for purposes of establishing the principle that in the event that a couple can only have a child through artificial insemination, they would take the zera, would take the seed of the husband and implant it through artificial insemination into the womb of the wife, that the father would be considered, from a halakhic perspective, to be the father of the child. The husband would be considered to be the father of the child, and therefore, not only is this a way of resolving the fertility issues of the wife and the husband together, but not only the wife, but also the husband would be considered to be the halakhic parents of this child. And in fact, this has other ramifications as well, because let's say that a couple only has a child through artificial insemination, then the husband dies without having any other children other than the child or children born through artificial insemination. So there's a Torah law that if a man dies without any halakhic children, then the wife is not allowed to remarry if the husband has a brother, unless she marries the brother, which is called yibum, or she goes through a ceremony known as chalitza with the brother-in-law, where the brother-in-law wears a special shoe, and the wife has to take the shoe off the brother, and only then is she allowed to marry other people. I, in fact, have performed, or I have officiated at 16 or 17 chalitzas over the years. It does come up from time to time. So one of the cases of chalitzos that I had to supervise was a case where the couple actually had a child, but the child was an adopted child. So an adopted child might be considered to be, according to Shlomo Kluger, on some level, a child for whom the parents would fulfill the mandate of pruavu, or procreation, but because it's not a biological child, everybody would agree that at least for purposes of yibum and chalitza, the wife would not be exempted, the widow would not be exempted from having to perform chalitza with the brother-in-law in order to be able to marry somebody else. That's just from a purely halakhic perspective, so we actually had to perform the chalitza anyway. But here, there's an actual biological relationship. So in this particular case, where a child had been born through artificial insemination, even though not everybody agrees, but in the sort of official textbook on the laws of chalitza nowadays, called Chalitza Kehilchasa, the author concludes that there are enough opinions out there that say that the child is considered to be directly linked to the donor of the zera, to the contributor of the seed, who was the father for artificial insemination purposes, that such a child would exempt the mother from having to perform chalitza afterwards, that she would no longer be linked to her brother-in-law, would be considered like she had a child with her now late husband, and therefore she wouldn't have to worry about those cases that come up every now and then when the brother-in-law, for example, refuses to perform chalitza, and then she would become an arguna. In fact, the question was posed about what if you have the following case. The husband contributed his zera. He contributed his seed, but they never got around to performing artificial insemination, or the husband contributed a lot of seed, and they preserved the seed of the husband. Some of it was used in order to try to impregnate the wife, but it didn't work. The fertilization didn't take place, but they had in mind that they'll use some of the other seed. They made a whole bunch of test tubes of the husband's seed, that they would try it on a later date at a later occasion. And then the husband died, but the seed is still around. And now the wife wants to use some of the leftover seed of the husband to try to become pregnant afterwards. So if the child is born after the husband died, and she was already obligated to perform a chalitza in order to be able to remarry with the brother-in-law, can she now become pregnant after the husband's death, and thereby become exempt if she has a viable child from having to perform the mitzvah of chalitza? And this is a whole discussion that took place within the last decade or two. One of the contemporary Rabbanim was the head of the Eretz Chemda Institute in Yerushalayim. Eretz Chemda is a kollel that's made up of very motivated young kollel students, some of them from the yeshiva university world, who are committed to being very learned, but also being very much in touch with the needs of the current society. And it's a kind of progressive-minded, while halakhically loyal kollel institute, because of the fact that they're so progressive. They might have had a little bit more trouble getting Dayanis appointments in Eretz Yisrael than the students from other institutions. But my old chavusa from when I was in the smicha program at YU is an Eretz Chemda graduate, and he was actually up for election this past period to become appointed as one of the Dayanim by the Rabbanut. Didn't quite make it, but my opinion is certainly very worthy of it. I think he's authored many of the tshuvos, and there they have volumes of responsa, which are called B'marei HaBazak. I think he's this chaver of mine, I think is the author of many of those tshuvos. So this question was posed to the Eretz Chemda Institute, and Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, who was the posek, was the rabbi who was the supreme halachic authority for the institute while he was still alive. So Rabbi Yisraeli came to the conclusion that such a child would not exempt the mother from yibum, because the exemptions all have to be in place at the time the husband dies. But a question on that is that if the wife was pregnant at the time the husband died and then had a viable child from that pregnancy, that would in fact exempt her from chalitza. So why would this be any different? So the answer that he says is that in the case of pregnancy, the child is already in the early viable stages of formation. The child is already in the mother's body, and there's already a fertilization process which is underway. However, here the fertilization has not taken place altogether, therefore the child is not considered to be a viable future being at the time of the husband's death, and the wife would still have to perform chalitza. Furthermore, he says, let's say that the zera is out there, but when there's an investigation of the husband's progeny, the investigation yields the conclusion that he doesn't have any children, grandchildren, not from this wife, not from anybody else, and then she doesn't just perform chalitza, but she performs yibum with a brother-in-law. So then if 5 years later, some of his leftover seed in the test tubes is going to be used to produce a child from his wife, and we're going to say that this child is now attributed to him, so then it's going to turn out that his late wife was living in terrible sin with her husband's brother, which is considered to be Giloy Arayos. It's considered to be a capital offense in a situation where the husband had actually had children prior to his death. So therefore, it says Rabbi Yisraeli, since we know that all the ways of the Torah are ways of peace, it cannot be that the Torah would retroactively characterize the wife's relationship with her brother-in-law as one of a capital sin, as one of Giloy Arayos, of an abject offense, and therefore it must be that there's a cutoff point in terms of whether a child is already in the process of being brought to term at the time of the husband's death, in order for the widow to be exempt from chalitza, but otherwise, if it's born afterwards, the widow is not exempt from chalitza. However, Rav Nosson Gestetner, who's a dayan in Bnei Brak, wrote an essay in which he disagreed with Rav Shaul Yisraeli, and he says that the critical question with respect to chalitza is whether there is an application of what the Torah calls v'lo yimaches shemo Yisrael, that the name of the late husband should not be blotted out in the Jewish people. So he says, in the event that a child is born from the husband even 5 years after the fact, what do you know? Lo and behold, his name has not been blotted out because he has a child who came from his seed. So therefore, even 5 years later, he says that would also serve to exempt the wife, and in the event that the brother-in-law had been refusing to perform chalitza, this is another solution to aguna problems, just leave over a lot of zera, leave over a lot of extra seed. So then the husband at that point would be considered to have a seed, to have a progeny, to have a child that was left behind, and then the wife would in fact, at least he says there's a strong argument, that the wife would be exempt from chalitza. I would say that this is probably a more appropriate application in our times of deracheh darchei noam, that the ways of the Torah are ways of peace, because nowadays women don't really perform yibum anymore. Even in Sephardic circles, where they used to be more popular, there was a decree issued by the chief rabbinate of Israel in the early 1950s by both the Ashkenazic chief rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, and the Sephardic chief rabbi, Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel at the time, decreeing that even within the Sephardic community, they should no longer perform yibum, but rather only perform a chalitza. So chalitza has become much more the norm for both Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities, and any way in which we can exempt a woman from having to perform chalitza and ensure that she be able to marry somebody else would probably lead to a greater fulfillment of deracheh darchei noam, of the ways of the Torah being ways of pleasantness, in addition to the fact that the Torah has a drasha that says, uvein ein lo, when is it that you require yibum or chalitza? When you see that there is no child that has been, that the person, that the husband has left at all. We had a case after the World Trade Center tragedy where there was a woman who did not have any children with her husband prior to his death, when he was one of the victims of the attack on the World Trade Center. And in fact, she had once been pregnant before, but she had miscarried. And at the time of his death, she discovered, I think shortly thereafter, that she was pregnant again. And then it was kind of this very awkward, tense situation where we had to wait 7, 8 months, whatever it was, after the 9/11 attack, to see whether she would give birth to a viable child. The child would be viable, then she would be exempt from chalitza because the husband had left behind the brother. And if the child would not be viable, God forbid, then she would have to perform chalitza with the brother-in-law in order to be able to remarry. And thank God it was a viable child. Not only a viable child, but a child who actually became friendly with one of my sons as the years went on. You had a question?
No, I thought you said, but you didn't say it. That the Bnei Brak Posek was saying just because there's zera, that's why?
No, not just because there's zera. Only if a child is actually born from that zera does it become attributable to the husband, even though the husband had died 5 years earlier. Now this, you can argue, according to that argument, this is yet another reason why nobody should do Yibum anymore, right? Because you never know, maybe there's some zera that the person left behind. Now we don't normally allow for the extraction of zera from a man's body because some of it will be destroyed and there is a prohibition against destroying one's seed. But if it needs to be extracted from the husband for procreative purposes, so then we would allow it. So that was obviously the case over here. I mean, now there are other applications to this principle. There was a recent case in Israel several months ago, I think it was in February of this year, where there was a soldier who died. And right after the soldier's death, I think since he had indicated that he very much wanted to have children, but he didn't have children at the time of his death, they decided to extract his seed from him immediately after his demise. I guess that there's now technology, you can do even that if it's done right away. And they filled up a few test tubes with his seed. And then the widow of this man said that it would be too traumatic for her to have a child from that seed. She didn't want to have a child anymore now that her husband had died, and she asked that it just be destroyed. But the man's parents, who knew that their husband very much wanted to have children, wanted to preserve the seed so that it could be it could be inserted into another woman who would be willing to carry a child with this late soldier's zera. And there was a whole dispute between the widow and the parents as to who should have the rights to the seed. And this wasn't decided by a rabbinical court, it was decided by one of the civil courts in the state of Israel, but they actually ruled in favor of the parents in this particular case. I think they asked of Mordechai Halperin, who's one of the halakhic authorities in Israel when it comes to matters of halakha and technology, and he said that in his own opinion, really the purpose of using zera using the seed in these situations is in the context of a happy and functional and full-fledged marital relationship with both a husband and a wife, and therefore he didn't really endorse it under these circumstances. But these are the types of questions that arise based on the reality of this reproductive technology. You had a question?
Yeah, no. So
yes.
if the husband dies, but there's seed, how quickly does the chalitza ceremony have to take place?
Well, if there's, again, it depends on whether the seed is of halakhic significance or not. If the husband dies and he leaves a pregnant wife, so then there's just a waiting period until the wife gives birth.
Right, but in the case where the wife isn't pregnant,
In the case where the wife isn't pregnant, there's a 3-month waiting period just to make sure that she isn't really pregnant. And if she's not showing a sign of pregnancy after 3 months, the assumption is that she's not pregnant. That was established before there were even pregnancy tests. So there's a pasuk in the Torah, Yikim Shlosh Chodashim, when Tamar became pregnant, so she was noticeable after 3 months. So the assumption is that after 3 months, one would notice that a woman is pregnant. That's why there's normally a 3-month waiting period. That was one of the proofs that was brought that it doesn't really count if a woman becomes pregnant after that with a husband's seed. If the pregnancy, if the injection of the seed is only after the husband's death, because there's another Gemara that indicates that a woman, sometimes it takes up until 3 days for the woman's egg to become fertilized by the seed. So the Noda B'Yehuda, the great halakhic authority, asked, well, if it could take up to 3 days, then sometimes the woman won't be pregnant until 3 days after, well, even if she had relations with her husband the day he died, maybe she won't become pregnant for 3 days afterwards, in which case the pregnancy won't show for 3 months and 3 days. So why don't we wait 3 months and 3 days? He said, this is proof that if we knew that the fertilization only took place after death, it wouldn't count. So therefore, if the woman does chalitza or yibum after 3 months, even if it turns out that she became fertilized within the 3 days after death, and then it shows that she's pregnant 3 months and 3 days later, that no longer has any relationship halakhically to her late husband, and therefore she still the yibum would still be appropriate, and if she did chalitza, the chalitza would still be effective under those circumstances, or would still be necessary under those circumstances. So that's the proof text that Rabbi Yisraeli brought for his proposition. Others say it's not such a perfect proof because the Taughtb himself said that he was not prepared to rely upon this rationale unless other rabbis agreed with him. There's no evidence other rabbis ever agreed with him. And he himself said, in the end, what was his case? His case was where the woman gave birth 1 year after her husband died. So he was trying to figure out, should we say that maybe it was from the husband, not from the husband, that maybe it was from the husband, but the fertilization didn't take place until after the husband's death. And finally he came to the conclusion that sometimes a woman delivers late. In this case, she gave birth 3 months late, but we'll assume it was from the husband. So that was the upshot of that decision. Now we had a case in the Beis Din of a man who did not die, but he and his wife were going through a process of trying to become pregnant, of trying to utilize artificial insemination for purposes of having a child. And he cryovased, I think that's the correct pronunciation of the term, his zera, meaning that it was vacuum-packed, preserved, cryovased, so that it would be able to be used at different intervals. If the first attempt to insert his zera, his seed, into his wife would not yield a pregnancy, then they would be able to do it again. But then, over time, as sometimes happens in marriages, they broke up and the marriage fell apart. So the husband at that point didn't want to have a child with his wife anymore, but the wife still very much wanted to have a child, so she still wanted to use the seed to have a child. So she went to a rabbi, I believe in Crown Heights, for a decision. Is she allowed to use the seed or not of the husband? And the Beit in the rabbinical court, or this dayan, this rabbi from Crown Heights, ruled on her behalf that as long as they were still married, even if they were heading towards divorce, but they're still married as a husband and wife, she's still allowed to use the zera, she's still allowed to use the seed. And needless to say, the husband was going ballistic because he didn't want to be saddled with a child from this relationship now that they were getting divorced, and he didn't want his zera, his seed, to be out there. So this was a get case that came in front of the Beit Din, one of the weirdest, get disputes that I can recall, where the wife said, I want to get from my husband right away, and the husband said, I don't want to give her again until she can prove that she's destroyed all of the zera that's being stored at this medical facility. So it was an easy enough case to resolve because I turned to the husband and I said, she's only going to use the zera according to the decision she received from this rabbi in Crown Heights while you're still married according to Jewish law. So it's actually in your interest to give her a get as quickly as possible so that she won't be able to use the zera even if it hasn't been destroyed. So that worked out pretty well. So he gave the get, but then when we decided the case, we made sure to indicate that the wife had an obligation to provide whatever proofs were possible that the zera had in fact been destroyed, because we took the position that in this particular case, really both parents had rights to the reproductive materials that were produced for purposes of fertilization, and if he didn't want them to be used, then certainly he had that prerogative in this case. There was actually here in the United States a case just like that. It was called Davis versus Davis. It was a case that went in 1992 to the Tennessee Supreme Court, also with a divorcing couple. There it wasn't just a question about the cryo-based zera. It was actually maybe a little bit of a harder case, because in the case of the cryo-based seed, arguably the seed only belongs to the husband, and it's much more difficult for the wife to have asserted rights with respect to the seed that had not yet even been impregnated into her. But in the case of Davis versus Davis, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. That was a case where it wasn't artificial insemination that was utilized, but rather it was in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization is when the seed is combined with the egg outside of both of their bodies, and it produces a zygote, it produces a cell that will develop eventually into an embryo over the next few weeks. It's left in the Petri dish or wherever in order for the cells to multiply, to become a pre-embryo, to become an embryo, and then that embryo is eventually implanted into the woman's uterus. So sometimes there are these embryos that are lying around. So in that case, there was an embryo that was lying around for possible future transplantation into the wife's uterus, and the question was whether, in this case, the wife had rights to insist that she be implanted with that embryo even after the couple's divorce, so whether, since the husband also contributed to it with his seed, he could stop that from taking place. And I think that the eventual decision of the Supreme Court was that the husband had the right to prevent that procedure on the part of his wife. Following the divorce, it was, I suppose, along similar lines, except the reasoning was a little bit different. I think that the court said that their general reasoning was that there's kind of like a public interest, the public policy interest, that whenever somebody is in favor of contraception, we're always in favor of promoting the cause of contraception. So I don't know that that would necessarily be the halakhic approach towards resolving that case, but it was similar in certain ways to the case that came in front of our Beis Din with respect to the cryo-based zera. So these are some of the very interesting shilos that arise in the context of artificial insemination, but then there's the next layer of artificial insemination, which is called AID, artificial insemination with a donor. What does that mean? I don't even know if it's a politically correct term anymore, although I think that the term still exists in medical literature, but it means artificial insemination with a donor who is not the mate of the woman who is being impregnated. That's technically what it means. And the question discussed by halakhic authorities is, to the degree that most halakhic authorities are favorably inclined towards artificial insemination with the husband's zera and the wife's body, if this is going to assist them in being able to have a child. But what if the husband's zera, just the real problem is that the husband does not have seed? You'll pardon me, this is just my halakhic refinement, if you want to call it that I just used the word seed rather than a different word that I could use in public. But what if instead of the halakhic, of the seed of the husband, because the husband's seed is not capable of impregnating anybody, there's a problem with his seed, the wife wants to use somebody else's seed. She's married, but she wants to use somebody else's seed. Is that okay halakhically? First of all, is that adultery? So there's a whole discussion as to whether that would be considered to be adultery, because the pasuk in the Torah that describes adultery doesn't describe it per se through a relationship of a man and woman sleeping together. It says, Vel Eishis Amischa, that with respect to your friend's wife, Lo Sitein, or the wife of your fellow, Lo Sitein Shechaktecha Lizara, the seed should not be placed into your fellow's wife for purposes of impregnating her. So it sounds a little bit like, even if it's not through an intimate relationship, a sexual relationship, even if it's through some other means, maybe adultery could potentially be taking place. And that seems to be the way that the verse is understood or is interpreted by the Ramban. In his commentary, he says, yes, the purpose is because what's the reason for the prohibition? That we don't want to mix together different seed from different men in the same woman, because then nobody will know whether the child is from this man, whether the child is from another man. It's going to cause all kinds of incestuous relationships to take place in the future. So it sounds like maybe even artificial insemination using another man's seed could create mamzeres, could create illegitimacy. So some poskim say that. Most poskim, however, say it doesn't create illegitimacy. Some say, however, we see from the way in which the prohibition is phrased in the Torah that at least it's prohibited, even if it doesn't create illegitimacy. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says that this does, Moshe Feinstein, who wrote a lot about this subject towards the end of the 20th century, said, no, it can't possibly create illegitimacy because illegitimacy can only be created through an actual sexual relationship. He's very, very strong about that. And therefore, he says that it's technically not prohibited, but if one would be worried about illegitimacy, and certainly one has the right to be worried about if we're going to say that the child is attributed to the donor of the zera, so if the donor is another Jewish man, and that Jewish man has other children, it's possible that the child from this artificial insemination will marry their sister or brother from their father, so we want to avoid that. So he says that in these situations it's permissible to utilize donor seed. The donor seed should come from a non-Jewish man, because then you won't have the problem of a halakhic relationship with the other children of this man. And there's also a technical point in halakha that many people don't know about, which is that if a married woman commits adultery with a non-Jewish man, the child is not illegitimate, interestingly enough. So he says even if there would normally be a taint of illegitimacy, you would avoid it in this case. The Satmar Rebbe, the Minchas Yitzchak, the Dayan of the Eidah Charedis in Yerushalayim, and a number of other rabbinic authorities were absolutely livid about this ruling of Moshe Feinstein. They thought it was like the worst ruling that he ever made in his life, and that this created a real milchama, a real war in the halakhic world over this particular issue, where they said that it's absolutely inappropriate. A woman who does such a thing would be grounds for divorcing her on the part of her husband. All kinds of terrible consequences emerge from this type of activity, and they absolutely prohibited AID and for a married woman to utilize the zera, to utilize the seed from a non-Jewish man. Now remember that whenever there's a bank which is used in order to manufacture the zera, the seed that the woman's going to use for artificial insemination, it can generally be assumed that most donors, since most people in the universe are not Jewish, the most donors that they would come from a non-Jewish source. So according to Rav Moshe, in a dire situation where a woman really wants to get pregnant, and this is the only zera, and the only way she can get pregnant is through the seed of another man, it would be permitted. But Rav Moshe does say, that she does have to get permission from her husband. It's not a nice thing to do to get pregnant from another man's seed without your husband's permission. That far, Rav Moshe Feinstein does in fact go. I think that would, generally be the assumption from the standpoint of halakha. But this does come up because sometimes a person who has been born through artificial insemination is not necessarily the product directly of his father. This sometimes comes up in the context of when we perform a get at the Beit. And I remember once we performed the get at the Beit, and we just asked, there's a standard question that's asked because you always write the person's name and their father's name. If it's a woman, you write her name and her father's name. The man, you write his name and his father's name. So we always ask, are you a natural born child to your parents, or both of your parents born Jewish? So we'll know whether to write the father's name. And most of the time, the answer is yes and yes, or maybe they weren't both born Jewish, and we have to take that into account. But I remember at least one case where the response was, well, actually, I'm not completely a natural born child from my father because I was born through artificial insemination, and the zera, the seed that was used, was not from my father. And a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know this one way or another, but this person actually knew it, so it created a question as to what name to write in the get, although you should know that many authorities are of the opinion that you could always write the name of the man who raised the child as the father, because based on the earlier sources that we brought today, on some basic fundamental level, that person is considered to be the father. I'll finish with this today and we'll continue next time, but the next sort of contemporary question that arises from this whole question of AID, of donor zera, is in a situation where the woman's not in fact married. The woman's not married, but she very much wants to have children, and she's afraid she's not going to find a zivig, she's not going to find a husband in time to actually get married. Can she go through this process where she uses the zera, the seed, from, say, a non-Jewish man, that she doesn't necessarily, she's not going to know his identity per se, she just goes to the hospital to have this procedure, or to a doctor to have this procedure performed, so that she'll be able to have children. She's in her late 30s, early 40s, whatever it happens to be. And we know of cases where people do this. This is something that occurs within our community. Is this something which is permissible? So again, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, the child is not considered to be born from an illicit relationship, even if it's a man with whom the woman would not be able to get married. Rav Moshe even goes so far to say, and Rav Avadia Yosef says the same thing, that if a daughter would be born from this type of zera, the daughter would be permitted to marry a Kohen. Normally, if a non-Jewish man has a daughter together with a Jewish woman, that daughter is not allowed to marry a Kohen, at least in the first instance. They say there was no sexual act here, so therefore there's no taint on such a child, and she would be allowed to marry a Kohen. But is it appropriate for a woman to engage in this type of artificial insemination procreative process without having a husband? So there's actually an article about this in the Techumin Journal by Rav Yigal Spern. Rav Yigal Spern writes that in his opinion, it is never appropriate to deliberately bring a child into the world without a healthy two-parent relationship to raise the child, and therefore, even though halachically it's not prohibited per se, there's no prohibited act that's taking place on the part of the woman, nonetheless, at least hashkafically, philosophically, it's not really right. And the authors of the Chuvos of B'marei Bazak basically say the same thing. They even deal with a weirder case, or weird is the wrong word, with a more complex case of an almana, a woman who was a widow, who didn't have a chalitza situation. The husband didn't leave behind any brothers, but the husband didn't have any children, and this widow wanted to use some zera that was left behind by her husband for purposes of honoring her husband and also providing some companionship for herself by bringing a child to the world after her husband's death with her husband's zera. And the B'marei Bazak, the Kollel members of B'marei Bazak in their tshuva, in their response, said, technically speaking, it's not prohibited, but it's not something that they encourage to bring a child into the world under those circumstances. On the other hand, it's very difficult for somebody who's not in the predicament of a woman who's worried about her biological time clock ticking away, not to be sensitive for the yearning and desire to bring a child into the world. So another method, and I'll end with this, that has been suggested and has been endorsed by halakhic authorities for a woman to sort of protect herself in that situation is for the woman to provide her eggs, which is something that a woman can do as well. That's what we call the in vitro fertilization process that we will discuss at greater length, God willing, next time. And to have those eggs frozen so that at the appropriate time that she does hopefully find somebody down the road, she can then utilize those eggs, have an in vitro fertilization performed between the seed of the man that she will eventually marry and the eggs that she has frozen, and those can be implanted in her body. That's the sort of thing where even if a woman is past her childbearing years in normal circumstances, she can still carry a child with an egg that was frozen beforehand and carry the child to term in viable fashion. There are cases of women who have done this in their 50s and even in their 60s. So that's something which is being more promoted and endorsed by halakhic authorities. But these are thorny issues, and I go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is that we have a real obligation because of the paramount value and significance which is placed by halacha on enabling people who want to bring children into the world to be able to do so in halakhically permissible fashion. We have a real responsibility to identify all of the reproductive technologies that can assist individuals in this situation in order to be able to assist them in accomplishing the goal of procreating, in order to accomplish the goal of bringing about the children for the next generation. And this is the real message of the word choshishin in the passage of the Gemara that I quoted earlier, that it's our job to really worry about everybody who is out there and worry about what we can do to help individuals who are experiencing problems in terms of infertility, so that collectively we can fulfill what the Gemara talks about in Masechah Shabbos. It says that after 120 years, when you go up to heaven, so you're asked 6 questions. I think that would be like a good Mitch Albom book, right? Like, the 6 questions you're asked in heaven. So we're asked the six questions, and one of the questions that we're asked is, Asakta b'priya v'ribya. Did you engage in the mitzvah of pruavu? It doesn't say, others have pointed this out, it doesn't say, kiyamta priya v'ribya. Did you fulfill pruavu? As I said, sometimes that's beyond our control, but asakta, were you engaged in helping others and really being sensitive towards everybody's needs and everybody's predicaments? So that's something that we all have to do it in our own way. Okay, have a good night.
There's a Marv meeting beginning about now. I think we'll stay in the shore, so everyone can find their spots, and we'll begin with the moment. But, well, okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure.